Chapter 9. After having changed into rough clothes suited to a servant boy, I rode my horse to within a mile of the Norman camp. I tethered it to a tree and made the rest of the journey on foot across the countryside. Keeping to hedges and narrow tracks, I reached a small wood about half a mile away from their camp just as darkness was falling. I peered out over the cover of the trees and bushes. Even in this half-light of dusk, I could see the Norman camp was enormous, stretching across open ground for at least a mile to the higher walls of the huge wooden castle. Inside that castle, so I'd been told, were it was Norman Duke William and his knights. The ordinary soldiers were spread across the vast area. I could see their tents and horses, and large fires burning to keep them warm and cook their food. The soldiers sat in groups or walked about. I looked for guards at the edge of the camp, but there were very few. Just an occasional pair of soldiers set at long distances and armed with spears, supposedly keeping watch. But mainly, seemed to me, talking. They appeared very relaxed about keeping guard, but then, why wouldn't they? They knew where the English camp was, on the ridge at Colbeck Hill, 8 miles away. If an attack was launched, then it would be easily seen. Thousands of men would not be hidden so easily. All it needed was one shout from one of the guards and the whole camp would spring into action. But they would not be watching for one boy. At least, that's what I hoped. I crawled along the ground until I was at a point halfway between 2 guard posts, and then I continued, moving slowly, stopping every now and then to check if the guards were alert to my coming. I made it through the gap between the guard posts and carried on crawling until I reached a small clump of bushes. Once there, I stood up, brushed the leaves and grass off my clothes, and surveyed the scene inside the Norman camp. The enormous size of the camp, many thousands of men, didn't daunt me. Our own camp was just as large, and I had grown up as my father's page close to large armies and battles. My worry was that I would be spotted as an imposer, as an English spy. Even though I had learnt French from my tutors, I wasn't as fluent in it as someone like Osric. My best chance would be to pretend to not be very bright, and that way any stumbles in my speech would be excused as my being a simpleton. I headed for the nearest fire, and the soldiers gathered around it. As I drew near, a soldier stepped in front of me, barring my path, and pointed a spear at me, and, in French, ordered me to stop. So they had guards on duty inside the camp. I stopped and forced a friendly smile. The guard didn't smile back. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "I'm looking for my brother," I said. "His name's Pierre." The guard frowned. "Who?" he asked. We got separated earlier," I told him. "Who are you with?" This is the question I'd been dreading. According to the information my father had been able to pass on to me, the Norman Duke had 4 different regiments of soldiers with him. One was his own army, the others were led by Alan the Red, William Fitzosborne, and the last by Eustace, the Count of Boulogne. If I said the name of one of them, and that turned out to be the very group I walked into, I'd soon be proved a liar. But there was another group made up of priests and servants, who weren't expected to take part in actual fighting. He said, if we got separated, he'd be with the priests, but I don't know where they are. I gave him a helpless and miserable look, and he lowered his spear and nodded. "Right now they'll be busy praying for our victory," he said. He hesitated, then obviously took pity on me because he asked, "Have you eaten?" I shook my head. "Why don't you come and have a bowl of stew with us? It'll warm you up on a cold night like this. After then I'll take you to where the priests are and you can find your brother." "Thank you," I smiled gratefully. I followed the soldier to the big roaring fire. A large cauldron was hanging from a spit over the fire, and a cook was serving stew into wooden bowls. My new soldier friend took a bowl of stew himself and then handed one to me. "Come on," he said, "let's join my friends." Carrying the bowl, I followed him to where a small group of soldiers were sitting together, soaking up the liquid from the stew with bread and scooping the meat into their mouths with their fingers. I sat down with them and began to eat in the same way. The stew tasted good. but I suddenly realised how hungry I was. I hadn't eaten nearly all day. The other soldiers looked at me curiously. "Who's this?" asked one. "Oh, he got separated from his brother," said the guard. "He said his brother's with the priest. Right now they'll be fasting as part of their prayer for victory. I thought he wouldn't get any food there, so might as well have a bite with us." One of the other soldiers laughed. "That's true," he chuckled. He grinned at me. "Take a tip, boy. Stay with us. You'll be better fed than if you're with the priests." The others joined in the laughter at this, and one added, "Mind you, find it a bit tougher with us than with the priests. While they're down there on their knees, praying for victory, we're in the middle of action, making sure the victory happens." This caused even more laughter. Then one of the soldiers asked me, "Have you ever been in a battle, boy?" I shook my head. "No," I said. "I'm a servant. My brother said this was my chance to see our army victorious." "Your brother's right," nodded one of the men. "King Harold and his men will fall apart once we attack." I gave a shrug. I wasn't going to reveal myself, but I wouldn't let that pass. "My brother says the English fight well," I said. "He said they defeated the Vikings." "And that's their problem," said one of the men. "They don't have the strength for another big battle so soon after the last one, and that long march south they've just done will have killed them." There's a big difference between the way Duke William's army go about battle and the way the Vikings do. "Our archers," nodded a man, "they rain down on the enemy, death from the skies. No one can stand a chance against those arrows coming down. And then, when our arrows have laid most of them low, that's when we go in." And he picked up his spear, waved it above his head, while another man pulled his sword from its scabbard and held it high before replacing it. "We're the infantry," said the men proudly. "Foot soldiers, hand-to-hand combat. We break them down, open them up in a gap on the front line. That's where the cavalry come in. After we've done all the hard work," put in another, his tone complaining. "And then, if we don't break through their lines, then we've got to do the whole running trick." And he winked at the other men, chuckled broadly. "What's the old running away trick?" I asked. "It's the oldest trick in the book," said the man. "So old they reckon the Romans used it. Say the enemy is holding firm and we can't get an opening in their defences. That's likely with the English. They do this thing called a shield wall, where they lock the edges of the wooden shields together, so it makes like a wall they hide behind." I knew what he meant. I'd seen the shield wall in action at Stamford Bridge. "Well, if that happens, then we charge at them, then we turn around and run away, like we've given up and we're retreating." Sure enough, time after time, the enemies think that we're beaten and chase us. And once they do that, we stop and turn and face them. And then our cavalry charge at them and cut them down. He smiled broadly. "Works every time." "Nearly every time," another man corrected him. "I've known times when the enemy haven't chased us." "All right, nearly every time," conceded the first man. "And when will the battle start?" I asked. And this is where it was an awkward, strained silence, and I wondered if I'd asked too much. It was a stupid question to ask, too obvious. 2 days? 3? I added quickly, hoping to show my ignorance. I wanted to make sure that I want to find my brother before the battle starts. "Your brother hasn't told you?" asked one of the men, puzzled. I looked back at him, doing my best to look equally puzzled. "Told me what?" I asked. The men exchanged looks, then shrugged. "Maybe his brother wants to keep him right away from it," he said. "I'm still surprised no one's told him," said the brother. "Tell me what?" I repeated. "The battle begins tomorrow. We attack at first light."